September 1887. Copper Bow Valley, Montana Territory. The mountains have already made their decision about winter. Snow on the peaks. Cold in the air that doesn't ask permission. A woman stands alone in the middle of a ranch yard. Road dust still on her boots. 6 days of wilderness still on her hands. Around her, hired men who won't meet her eyes. A housekeeper frozen on the porch steps. A foreman gripping his hat like a weapon he hasn't decided to use. Across from her, a man on horseback. Badge catching the noon light. A document in his hand. Legal, official looking, certain. She reaches out and takes it. The yard goes silent. 1 line, 2 lines. Something shifts behind her eyes. Not fear. Something colder than fear. And the man standing behind her, the largest man anyone in this valley has ever seen, goes completely, absolutely still. Nobody moves, nobody breathes. She opens her mouth. The train from Zanesville, Ohio took 5 days. 5 days of coal smoke and window glass cold enough to press your forehead against when the heat inside the car got unbearable. 5 days of watching Ohio flatten into Indiana, and Indiana flatten into something more honest about what flatness actually meant. And then the land started to lift and wrinkle, and eventually the wrinkles became mountains. And the mountains became something that didn't have a word for it in any vocabulary Clara Voss had been raised with. She counted the words in the letter 3 times. She would admit to once, if pressed, 47 words. She'd read enough contracts in her 6 years cutting fabric for other women's lives to know that 47 words was either very efficient or very dangerous. And she had sat in the second-to-last car of the westbound train, with her mother's herb journal in her lap, and tried to decide which one applied here. The letter was folded in her coat pocket. She could feel its shape through the wool when she pressed her palm flat against her side, which she had done approximately once every hour since Dayton, though she would have denied doing it more than twice. Next to the letter, a mother-of-pearl button she'd carried. Since the morning, her mother pressed it into her hand at the door of the boarding house, the last morning before Clara left for the Mill District. "Keep it," her mother had said. "So you remember you came from something solid." The button was the size of a dime and had a small chip along one edge. Clara had kept it for 6 years without once thinking it would end up in her pocket on a train to Montana. The other item in her coat, 2 biscuits, wrapped in paper, bought at the Springfield station before departure. Plain. Already going stale on day 1. She'd been saving them for a reason she couldn't quite name, which was either thrift or superstition, and she'd decided not to examine the distinction too closely. Her valise sat on the rack above her. Brown leather. Brass fittings on 3 of the 4 corners, the 4th having given up somewhere outside of Columbus. Inside, the calico dress she wasn't wearing, folded with the precision of someone who understood that a dress treated well lasted longer than a dress treated casually. The herb journal, its cover worn soft from years of her mother's daily handling. A tintype photograph so faded the faces had become suggestions rather than people. And the letter. The letter she'd already put in her coat pocket, which meant she was counting it twice. 47 words from a man named E. Calhoun. She'd answered the advertisement in the Ohio Recorder on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting at the table in her room with the lamp turned down to save oil. She'd read perhaps 40 advertisements over 2 years, in the way a person reads a thing they're interested in, without being willing to admit they're interested in it. Most of them sounded like men describing what they needed, the way you'd describe a needed tool: reliable, sturdy, good in poor conditions. This one was different. The handwriting looked like someone who had learned to write late in life and had taken it seriously ever since. No flourishes, no wasted loops. Each letter planted on the page with the deliberateness of someone who understood that words were not decorative. "Dear Miss Voss, I am a man of few words and no pretense. I have land, a sound house, and need of a companion who is not afraid of hard winters or hard work. If you are willing to take a chance on a stranger, I will meet you at Harwick Station on September 14th. 47 words. She had written back the same night. 3 letters over 3 months. Each one she'd tried to write the way she actually was, rather than the way she thought she was supposed to sound. She'd written about her mother's herb journal, about the pressed flowers slowly flattening between the pages. She'd written that she was competent at necessary things and uninteresting at most everything else, which was an honest sentence that she'd almost crossed out 3 times before deciding to leave it. She'd written that she expected a fair chance and nothing beyond it. He'd sent a train ticket with his third letter. She'd bought a new pair of gloves for the journey, and then decided the money was better kept and worn the old ones instead. Now the train was slowing. Through the window, a sky so blue it registered as a kind of rebuke to every gray Ohio morning she'd woken into for the past 6 years. Mountains to the north already wearing their first snow at the peaks. The air, even through the glass, had a quality she couldn't name yet. Thin, maybe. Cold in a way that had intentions. The platform at Harwick came into view. It smelled of pine resin and cold iron and the last breath of a train that had been here and was now leaving. Clara stepped onto the platform with her valise in her right hand and 6 days of travel in the set of her shoulders, and looked around at a space that was emptying rapidly of everyone who had a place to go. She waited. The station clock read 2:14 in the afternoon. At 2:30 she was the only person left on the platform. The station master was a man in his 60s, with a jaw that moved continuously, working at something, and fingernails that had not been clean in what appeared to be years. He looked at her letter with the expression of a man being asked to translate a language he half recognized. Calhoun, you say? He turned the letter over. Iron Bell Ranch. He said those 3 words differently than he said the rest. The way you say the name of something larger than a name. That's Rhett Calhoun's outfit. Owns the biggest stretch of land in the whole Copper Bow. 40,000 acres, give or take. A pause that sat somewhere between information and something else. Nobody from Iron Bell come through today. Not yesterday, neither. Clara folded the letter and put it back in her coat pocket, pressed her palm flat against it, feeling its shape and the shape of the button beneath the wool, then let her hand drop. Is there a route to the ranch from here on foot? The station master, Walt Greer, squinted past her at the mountains. There's the North Road, 6 hours on horseback, 12 on foot if the ground's still soft from last week's rain. He scratched his jaw. There's a closer way, though. Greystone Pass cuts through the foothills about 2 miles west. 4 hours walking if you keep a pace. Horse trail, mostly, but passable for a person on foot. Follow Quiet Fork Creek once you're in the canyon, can't lose it. He looked at her valise. He looked at the mountains. I wouldn't recommend it for a woman traveling alone. Which direction is west? He pointed. Clara picked up her valise. He called after her as she reached the edge of the platform. Something about a Thursday train east if she wanted to wait. Something about sending word to the first. She didn't answer. Not because she was dismissing him. Because she had learned early and learned thoroughly that certain kinds of forward motion only worked if you did not give yourself the option of going back. And standing on that platform was already offering her too many options. She stepped off onto the packed dirt road without looking behind her. She had gone perhaps 30 steps when she heard the footfall behind her on the planking, deliberate and evenly spaced, and then a voice at her left shoulder that had no business being as close as it was. Miss Voss. She turned. The badge caught the afternoon light first, then the hat, angled at the specific degree of a man who had decided a long time ago that authority was partly a matter of geometry. The man wearing both was perhaps 40, broad through the chest, with a smile that was doing work she couldn't quite identify yet. The smile was too ready. That was the first thing. Deputy Silas Pruitt. He touched the brim of his hat without quite tipping it. I saw you come off the train. Thought I'd make sure you got sorted out all right. Clara looked at him. I'm sorted. You're looking for Iron Bell Ranch. She hadn't told him that. She had not said anything to this man before this moment. She had spoken to Walt Greer inside the station while this man was outside, and the station was not a building with thin enough walls to carry conversation through, which she had noted on the way through, having spent 6 years in a boarding house with walls exactly that thin and knowing what they sounded like. She looked back at the station doorway. Greer had gone inside, but the window next to the door caught the light in a specific way, and through it she could see the shape of him, bent over the telegraph equipment. She looked at Pruitt. Word travels fast in a small town, she said. It does. The smile held. Matter of fact, that's something I wanted to speak with you about. There's a regulation in Harding County regarding women arriving under marriage correspondence. A residency documentation fee, $15, paid to the county office, which would be my office in this case. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Just a matter of getting your paperwork in order before you head out to a property. Perfectly standard. Clara did not take the paper. What is the ordinance number? The smile adjusted. Just slightly. I beg your pardon? The ordinance number. Every county regulation has one. It's assigned when the ordinance is adopted and recorded in the county ledger. I'd like the number so I can verify it. Well, now, it's not the sort of thing most folks need to. And the date of adoption. The date it was voted on by the county commissioners. Clara shifted her valise to her left hand. And whether the fee generates a numbered receipt that would be filed in duplicate. 1 copy to me and 1 copy to the county record. A moment, Pruitt's smile had not disappeared. But it had changed character entirely. It was now doing a different job than it had been doing 30 seconds ago. You're making this complicated, he said, and his voice had dropped a register, just slightly. Just enough to let her know the pleasant version of this conversation was available, but not guaranteed. It's a straightforward county process. Then those are straightforward questions. Clara looked at him with the same directness she'd been maintaining since Dayton, because it was the thing most entirely her own and she had no intention of lending it out. I'm going to walk to the county sheriff's office and ask whether this ordinance exists and request the ordinance number and date. If it does exist, I'll come back to your office and pay the $15 and apologize for the delay. She adjusted her grip on the valise. If it doesn't exist, I imagine the sheriff will have some questions of his own. Pruitt was still smiling, but his hands had gone still at his sides. Suit yourself, Miss Voss, though I'll tell you, a woman alone in this valley, heading out to a ranch on a back trail, there are considerations that go beyond paperwork. Clara let the sentence sit in the air for a moment. Then she said, I appreciate your concern, in a tone that did not particularly sound like appreciation, and turned back toward the western road. She had gone 4 steps when she heard him take 2 steps in the other direction, toward the station. She didn't look back to see what he said to Greer through the door. She didn't need to. The 2-step pivot and the lowered voice were enough. She kept walking. The road west of Harwick ran flat for the first half-mile past a livery barn and a hardware supply, and 2 buildings that might have been either residences or small businesses. It was hard to say with certainty. Then the land changed without announcement into something that had no equivalent in any geography she had grown up with. The pines began. Not the spaced, manageable variety you'd find along a farmhouse lane or planted decoratively around a county building. Montana timber. Packed close and running vertical up hillsides that were steeper than they looked from the valley floor, and the undergrowth between the trunks was dark and dense, and gave off a smell like the inside of a stone building that had been sealed for a long time, and then opened to air that had been nowhere near a city. Her valise was heavier than its contents warranted. She switched hands every 20 minutes with the regularity of someone who had made a plan and intended to keep it. She was not fragile. 6 years of working a treadle machine 8 hours a day had built a specific kind of endurance that looked ordinary from the outside and did not quit under pressure. Her hands were calloused across the palm from the scissors. Her back was straight because her mother had told her at 22 that the habits you built in your working years were the ones you lived inside for the rest of your life. And Ruth Voss had been right about most things she said, which made her absence a particular kind of ongoing inconvenience. Clara had not done much mountain walking. That was a separate category from ordinary endurance, and she was learning its requirements in real time. The junction appeared after 40 minutes. The north road curved right, wide and wagon-rutted, clearly the main route. A narrower trail angled west into the trees, marked by nothing except a rough post. Someone had driven into the earth and not labeled, which was either local knowledge or a philosophical statement about signage. A man was splitting wood near a lean to set back from the junction. 50, maybe. Red-faced, swinging with the rhythm of someone who had performed this exact motion 10,000 times, and had stopped thinking about it. He watched her approach without interrupting his rhythm. Greystone Pass? Clara gestured toward the unmarked trail. He set his axe down, looked at her valise, looked at the sky with the automatic assessment of someone who had lived by weather his whole life. Horse trail, not a foot road, but passable if you watch your footing on the upper section where the shale runs loose. Creek comes in alongside you once you're past the first canyon wall. Follow the water and you won't go wrong. He picked the axe back up. Keep moving and you'll beat the dark. She thanked him and took the left fork. The first 20 minutes were manageable. The pass had a quality she couldn't immediately name. The canyon walls weren't dramatic the way she'd expected mountain scenery to be from the pictures she'd seen in illustrated magazines. They were modest, close, the kind of enclosure that felt less like confinement and more like the landscape leaning in to pay attention. The trees pressed from both sides, and the light came through them in long pale columns that shifted when the wind moved the higher branches, so the whole pass seemed to breathe slowly, the way something breathes when it's sleeping. Quiet Fork Creek appeared where the woodcutter said it would, cold and quick and transparent down to the individual stones on the bottom, each one rounded smooth by water that had been performing this specific function since before anyone had been around to give it a name. Clara followed it north and let herself think, which was what she'd been carefully not doing for 5 days on the train. She thought about the letter, about what kind of man wrote 47 words and appeared to have meant all of them, about what kind of man learned to write late and took it seriously thereafter. She thought about Dayton, the room with the window that looked at the brick wall of the building next door, the treadle machine that needed oiling every Tuesday, the particular texture of 6 years of being useful to other people and invisible everywhere else. She had not left because she was unhappy, exactly. She had left because she was 24 years old and had begun to understand the difference between a life and an arrangement, and she was not willing to spend the rest of hers mistaking one for the other. The trail wound and narrowed. She shifted the valise to her left hand and used her right to steady herself where the path angled up along the canyon wall, loose shale sliding under her boot heel in exactly the way the woodcutter had warned her about. She was thinking about the handwriting on the letter, that careful, deliberate script that suggested someone for whom each word cost something, when the horse came around the bend, and she stopped so fast she nearly lost her footing entirely. Black. Enormous. The kind of horse that made the word horse feel inadequate, as though the word had been coined with something smaller in mind and had never been updated. A white blaze running straight down the center of its face like a seam. Standing in the middle of the trail with its reins loose in the dirt and its ears forward and its dark eyes fixed on her with an attention that felt almost considered. Nothing about the horse's posture suggested flight. It watched her the way something watches you when it's decided you're probably not a threat but hasn't fully committed to the conclusion yet. Clara set her valise down, took 2 slow steps forward, easy. Her voice came out quiet without her deciding to make it quiet. Easy now. The horse watched her, twitched one ear, did not move back. She was close enough to see the saddle clearly. Good leather, dark and burnished along the seat and skirt with the particular shine that came from years of a single rider's weight. Expensive once, and still well maintained, which was a specific combination that told you something about the person who owned it. On the near saddlebag, tooled into the leather inside a simple border, 3 letters pressed into the hide. IBR. Her hand had reached for the reins before the letters fully registered. She stood there with the leather in her hand and the horse breathing its warm breath against her cheek, and 3 letters sitting in the back of her mind like a door that had clicked open 1/4 of an inch. Iron Bell Ranch. She looked at the trail ahead of her, at the marks in the soft earth, hooves that had skidded, something large going sideways and then going down, the pale undersides of small displaced stones, showing their lighter undersides, which meant they'd been disturbed recently, within hours, not by weather or gradual erosion. A broken branch at chest height on the right side wall, bark scraped clean where something had grabbed for it. A dark smear on the rock face about 4 feet up, leather on stone, the color of a saddle skirt moving fast against a fixed surface. She followed the marks. The boulders were around the next turn. A fresh scar on the canyon wall showed pale against the weathered dark stone, sharp-edged where the break was new, still showing the internal grain of the rock rather than the gray surface face. Rock that had come down recently, hours maybe, not days. The trail marks led around and behind the largest fallen stone. Clara went around it. She stopped, a hand extended from beneath a slab of granite at an angle that was not any angle a hand would be in by choice, palm upward. Fingers slightly curled, the slow opening and closing of someone maintaining contact with consciousness by a thread they were not sure was holding. The palm was calloused across the base of the fingers in the specific pattern that came from years of rope and tool handle work. A plain silver ring on the 3rd finger, without any stone, catching a fragment of the light that still reached this part of the canyon. The ring was moving, very slightly, but moving. Clara dropped the valise. She was over the smaller rocks before she had finished processing what she was doing. one knee connecting with the rough stone surface through her skirt with enough force to tear the fabric at the hem. And she did not stop. She got around to where she could see the man's face, which required navigating around the edge of the largest fallen slab. And she had to stop for a moment when she did. She took this in the way you absorb something too large for a single glance and have to assemble it in sections, enormous, even horizontal, even half-buried, even unconscious. The scale of him required a recalibration. The shoulder she could see was broad enough to use as a writing surface. The arm stretched beside him was heavy with muscle down to the calloused, ring-bearing hand. Dark hair going silver at both temples, matted now with blood and grit from a gash above his right eyebrow that was still seeping into the earth under his head. A jaw that looked like it had been constructed to outlast ordinary circumstances. Several days of dark beard across it. And even in the complete absence of waking, even in the total looseness of a body that had lost the battle to stay conscious, there was something in his face that had not entirely stood down. Some quality of watchfulness still present beneath the surface, the way a fire is still present in embers. His left leg was beneath a slab of granite roughly the size and apparent weight of a cellar door. Clara looked at the slab, looked at her hands, which were already scraped from the climbing, and had transferred a thin film of blood to the reins of the horse still standing patiently around the bend. She thought, "This is not something one woman does alone," she thought. "There is no one else here," she thought, without giving herself the space to argue the point. All right then. The branch was 20 feet away, a fallen pine, straight-grained, roughly the diameter of her forearm, long enough to provide real leverage if she could get the geometry right. She dragged it through the loose rock, which was not quiet work, and which produced in the horse around the bend a soft shift of hooves on stone that told her it was still there and still calm, which was one piece of useful information. She got the branch wedged under the near edge of the slab, found a smaller stone to serve as a fulcrum, tested the angle, changed it, tested again. Her grip was uncertain because of the blood, and she repositioned twice before she had something she trusted. The slab was too heavy for the branch alone. She knew this before she tried. She tried anyway, because there were certain things you had to know for certain before you moved on, and this was one of them. The slab did not move. The branch flexed in a way that told her exactly how much load it was taking and exactly how much more it would need. She went back to the horse. She spoke to it while she worked the reins into a configuration she could use, keeping her voice low and even, not because she thought it would understand her, but because the sound of a calm human voice was its own kind of information for an animal that was already performing admirably under difficult circumstances. She tied the end of the rein line to the branch, put her weight on the branch, looked at the horse. "One step," she said. "Just one step forward." The horse looked at her with its dark, intelligent eyes. It leaned into the pull. The slab grated, an inch grinding on the smaller stones beneath it, then two. And under it, the man's leg shifted with the movement, and he made a sound that came from somewhere below language, a sound the body makes when the body has run out of other options, and Clara locked her arms and held her position on the branch, and kept her weight exactly where it was, and the horse kept stepping, kept the line taut, and the slab tipped sideways with a sound like a door, closing on something that had been open too long, and it slid, and the leg came clear. She sat down in the dirt. Her arms were shaking. She hadn't noticed until she stopped using them. The way you don't notice you've been holding your breath until the moment you finally exhale. The man's eyes were open, brown, dark enough to read as nearly black, fixed on her face with the focused desperation of someone assembling the present from components that kept sliding out of order. His lips moved. Nothing came through. She got her arm under his head, which weighed what a man's head weighs when he is not helping, and retrieved the canteen from the saddle and tipped a small amount of water against his mouth. He swallowed, coughed once, wet and rattling. Swallowed again. Water. The word scraped out. "I know," slowly. His eyes moved across her face with the deliberate effort of a mind coming back to itself from a long way off. Who? Someone who was walking through this pass. She pressed 2 fingers along the line of his shin, watching his face rather than her hands. What she was reading there was pain honest and significant, but not the specific escalating horror of bone moving against other bone. The joint is damaged, the bone is intact. He looked at the tipped slab, at the branch, at the marks the horse's hooves had made in the soft earth beside him, then back at her. "You moved that rock." The horse helped. His forehead wound was the more urgent problem. She could see that clearly now, deep, ragged at the edges, still seeping. That one needed closing. "There's a line cabin," he said. The words came one at a time, each one requiring separate effort. "Half-mile. Follow the creek north. Can you ride?" A pause that had real honesty in it. Not alone. Clara looked at the horse, looked at the man, made the specific calculation she had been making her whole life, not about what was easy but about what was necessary regardless of whether it was easy. "Then we ride together," she said. "If your horse doesn't object." The horse did not object. It stood with the professional patience of an animal that had decided she was probably trustworthy and was willing to extend credit until proven otherwise. Getting the man onto his own horse was the hardest physical thing Clara Voss had ever done in her life. She had at 20 moved a cast-iron stove across a kitchen floor by herself because the delivery men had said it wrong, and she'd needed the cooking surface before they could return for a correction. That had been hard. This was hard. He was semi-conscious through most of it, which helped with the resistance and complicated everything else. She positioned his good leg, got her shoulder under his arm, used the boulder beside him as a staging point, talked at him in the low, steady voice she used when she needed to direct without alarming, the voice she'd developed for clients who were difficult but had money and couldn't be argued with directly. "Your hand here. Foot, yes. The stirrup. That one." Something clarified in his face at the necessary moment. His good leg found the stirrup. Clara shoved from below with everything she had and he ended up across the saddle. And the specific mechanics of the final 18 inches would remain unclear to her afterward, which was probably for the best. She took the reins and started walking. The creek ran alongside her, cold and certain and entirely indifferent to everything happening on its bank. The light was beginning to fail. Not dramatically, not with Montana's usual directness, but with a gradual subtraction of warmth from the air that felt less like darkness arriving, and more like warmth deliberately departing. She walked. One foot, then the next. Her valise was back among the rocks where she'd dropped it. She did not think about it. She would go back for it, or she wouldn't, and either way there was more pressing business ahead of her right now. The cabin appeared between one step and the next. The way things appear when you've been concentrating hard on something else, and the world has arranged itself while your attention was elsewhere. A dark shape against the tree line. Low, solid, built from logs by someone who had expected the structure to outlast their personal interest in its condition. Stone chimney, 2 windows with actual glass, the creek within 20 feet of the west wall, and above the door, worked into a wooden crossbeam with whatever effort a heavy crossbeam required, 3 carved letters. IBR. Clara looked at those letters for a moment. She looked at the man draped across the saddle behind her, breathing in the shallow rhythm of someone running on what remained. She pushed the door open and got him inside. The cabin held the accumulated cold of a place unheated for weeks, but it was dry and it was shelter, and those were the 2 things the situation required. She found the fire materials on the first look, because whoever maintained this cabin was someone who understood that the person who arrived here in an emergency would not have the patience for a search. Kindling stacked in graduated sizes, lamp oil and matches in a tin box on the mantel, a folded wool blanket that smelled of cedar, supplies on the shelf, beans, cornmeal, dried beef, salt, a copper pot on a hook above the cold hearth. She got him onto the narrow cot against the east wall. She got the fire going on the 3rd match. She stood in front of it for 30 seconds with her eyes closed, holding her hands out until the warmth reached them. Then she opened her eyes and started working. The forehead wound was the priority. She had a sewing kit in her coat pocket, a small thing she carried, because you never knew. A needle, waxed thread, a pair of small scissors. The thread was intended for fabric. The needle was intended for fabric. The principle was identical. The material was not so different in the ways that mattered. She heated water in the copper pot, tore strips from her petticoat, the cleanest material she had access to, and cleaned the gash by firelight with the methodical care of someone who understood that haste in this particular kind of work cost more later than it saved now. 8 stitches. She had been taught to sew when she was 11 years old by a woman who had said, "Even spacing is not about aesthetics. It is about distributing the tension so that no single point bears more than its share." This had turned out to be true of more things than fabric. She tied off the 8th stitch and examined the result. Acceptable. The ankle came next. She went to the creek bank with the lamp and found yarrow in the undergrowth near the water, its flat white flower heads catching the lamplight. She knew yarrow the way she knew it from the herb journal, which meant she knew it the way her mother had known it, not as a curiosity but as a tool, described in handwriting so careful. It looked like someone who had been afraid of wasting paper. She crushed the leaves between 2 river stones she brought inside, applied the preparation to the ankle with even pressure, wrapped the joint firmly with the remaining strips of petticoat, elevated it on a rolled blanket, checked the stitches one more time. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the cot legs. She was not sure what time it was. The fire had burned from full logs to a steady settled burn. Outside the creek, inside, the slow breathing of the man on the cot, which had settled into something more regular than it had been an hour ago. Her valise was back in the canyon. Her mother's herb journal was in the valise. She did not let herself think about whether it was dry. She thought instead about the 3 carved letters above the door, about the 3 initials on the saddlebag, about a letter in her coat pocket signed E. Calhoun, Iron Bell Ranch, and about the silver ring on the 3rd finger of the hand that had been reaching upward from beneath a piece of granite and was now resting loosely on a folded blanket. The arithmetic was not complicated. She pressed her palm flat against her coat pocket and felt the shape of the letter and the shape of the button beneath the wool. She did not reach a conclusion. Not yet. Conclusions required evidence, and evidence required the man on the cot to be conscious enough to speak, and the man on the cot was not going to be conscious enough to speak tonight. She thought, wait. She had spent 6 years becoming very good at waiting when waiting was the useful thing. At 2 in the morning she woke to a change in his breathing, faster, shallower, the particular labor of a body fighting something on an interior front that could not be assisted from the outside. She pressed her palm to his forehead. Burning, she said, quietly. To no one in particular, right? Here we go. She fed the fire, got the water heating, changed the compress with the rotation her mother had shown her. Cool cloth, then warm, then cool again. The rhythm of keeping a fever from climbing while the body ran its processes. He was restless through the worst hours, muttering in shapes that approximated language without quite achieving it, his hands moving at things she couldn't see. He seized her wrist once, hard and sudden, with the grip of a man who did not know where he was, but understood that holding on mattered. She let him hold it, kept changing the compress with her other hand. I'm here, she heard herself say. Lie still, I'm here. Eventually the grip loosened, his breathing slowed. Dawn came gray through the 2 small windows, the cold mountain version of dawn that arrived not with warmth, but with the slow replacement of darkness by a thin pale blue that would eventually become morning if you were patient with it. By the time the light had gone from black to the color of old pewter, the fever had broken, the heat fading under her palm the way a stove cools when you stop feeding it. Gradually, in degrees too small to mark individually, Clara had not slept. She sat on the floor with her back against the cot legs and watched the light come through the windows and thought about 3 carved letters and 47 words, and the specific possibility that these 2 things were more directly related than she had allowed herself to consider until now. The evidence was not conclusive, but it was getting there. He woke at first proper light. She was at the hearth adding wood when she heard the change in his breathing, the shift from the rhythms of unconsciousness to something with deliberate intention behind it. She gave him a moment before she turned around. Where? Not a question. The beginning of orientation, a cabin. The one you mentioned before you lost consciousness. She poured water into a tin cup from the shelf, brought it to him. He took it with hands less steady than she'd have preferred but steadier than 3 hours ago, and drank with the careful economy of someone who understood rationing even before he was fully awake. His eyes moved around the room, took in the compress on his forehead, the wrapped ankle elevated, the fire, the strips of cloth drying on the hearthstone, the organized arrangement of the supply shelf. The leg, intact. The joint is another matter. You'll be off it for several days at minimum. She sat down in the chair across from him. The head wound I closed with 8 stitches. If you feel the stitches pulling, tell me. If you see redness spreading from the wound in any direction, tell me immediately. A pause. Are you hungry? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not suspicion, exactly. Something more careful than suspicion and more honest than calculation. The look of a man running a thorough assessment of a situation he had not anticipated and was not yet certain how to classify. Who are you? Someone who was walking through this pass. She held his gaze with the same directness she'd held since Harwick, because it was the one thing in her possession that required no maintenance. My name is Clara Voss. I came from Zanesville, Ohio. I'm on my way to Iron Bell Ranch. Something moved in his eyes. Fast. Controlled. Gone before she could name it. Iron Bell. That's what I said. She watched his face. The station master in Harwick said everyone in the valley knows the name. Said the owner has the largest land holding in the whole Copper Bow. A pause. Do you know him? His eyes went to the door beam, to the carved letters there, back to her, and in the half second it took him to complete that triangle, she saw what she was not supposed to see. The specific look of a man hearing his own name used in someone else's sentence and arriving one beat late to his response. I've heard the name, he said. Small Valley. Clara looked at the door beam, looked back at him. And yours? He looked at her. The wary assessing look she'd seen versions of since he'd opened his eyes. She watched him decide something, some question resolving itself on the side of partial disclosure. Cal, he said. Just Cal. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Then she looked at the fire, at the initials above the door, at the man on the cot who had declined to offer her his last name while lying in a cabin that belonged to someone whose last name she already had fairly strong suspicions about. She went to her coat, hung on the hook by the door, and retrieved the 2 biscuits from the pocket. Looked at them, both roughly the same size. She broke the larger one in half, examined the halves, then broke what had been the larger half in half again, making the bigger portion bigger still. She brought the larger portion across the cabin and set it in the hand lying flat on the blanket. He looked at the biscuit. He looked at her. Eat, she said. You need it more than I do right now. She returned to the chair, crossed her legs, and began eating her own portion slowly, in small pieces, making each one last. The biscuit was dry and slightly stale, and tasted like the Springfield station platform and the decision she'd made standing on it, which was not an unpleasant flavor, all things considered. He ate his portion in silence. She kept her face toward the fire and let him think whatever he needed to think. Outside, the Copper Bow morning was working its way toward the full expression of itself, cold and clear, the kind of clarity that arrived only after weather had processed through a place and left it scoured. The creek ran its steady commentary through the cabin wall. The fire settled into the long, comfortable burn of established logs rather than new ones, and somewhere between the sound of the fire and the sound of the water and the particular quality of silence that belonged to 2 people not speaking in a small room, Clara Voss began the quiet and methodical work of understanding exactly what she had walked into. She did not share this understanding with the man across from her. She was good at waiting. She would wait. The morning she went back for her valise was the second morning, not the first. She had considered going back the previous afternoon, when the light was still good, and the trail was still in her recent memory, but the fever had broken, and then reasserted itself briefly around midnight in a way that required attention, and by the time his temperature had settled into something that felt like it intended to stay settled, the canyon was dark and the creek was loud, and going anywhere alone, through Greystone Pass in the middle of the night, with a lamp that was already a third burned down, was not a plan. It was a wish, and Clara Voss had learned early the difference between those 2 things. So she waited. Because waiting, when it was the right choice, was not passivity. It was a form of precision. Her mother had said something like that once, though she'd said it about bread dough, but the principle transferred. She woke before him. The fire had burned to coals. She rebuilt it the way the cabin's wood supply suggested she should, which was carefully, because there was enough for 5 days if managed, and not enough for 5 days if not. She put water on. She checked his forehead with the back of her hand and found it where she wanted it, warm from sleep, not from a body at war with itself. He was still, the particular stillness of a man who had been awake in the dark for a while, thinking about something that didn't have a clean resolution. His hands flat on the blanket at his sides, not resting, processing. She was already pulling on her coat when he spoke. The upper section has loose shale, I know. You mentioned it. After rain it moves. It didn't rain last night. A pause that had the specific texture of a large man, arriving at the conclusion that he did not have a strong enough factual case to support the argument he wanted to make. The boots under the cot, he set it at the ceiling. Left there from last season. Too big for you, but the soles are thick. She looked. He was right. She found a length of cloth on the supply shelf, wound it around each foot inside the boots until they fit well enough to walk in, and left without making a point of it. The trail was shorter in the morning light. This was always true of ground you'd already traveled once, that compression of the familiar. But it was particularly noticeable here. The canyon walls that had felt close and watchful in the failing light of the previous evening now just felt like canyon walls. The creek did what it had always been doing. The shale section on the upper approach was exactly where he'd said it was, and she watched her footing on it exactly as he'd suggested. Not because he'd told her to, but because the stone was visibly unstable, and she had a basic interest in remaining upright. Her valise was where she'd left it. Wedged between two rocks, the 3 functioning brass fittings cold to the touch. She opened it and found the journal dry. She let herself feel the full weight of that relief before she picked up anything else, because some forms of relief were worth inhabiting completely, rather than moving through quickly, and this was one of them. The journal was her mother's handwriting. It was the careful script of a woman who had written slowly because each word was information someone was going to need someday, and had not wanted to get any of it wrong. It was pressed flowers going flat between descriptions of where yarrow grew, and what mugwort looked like when the dew was still on it. It was Ruth Voss, on paper, still available for consultation. Clara held it for a moment, then she registered the ground around her, because that was what she did. She read surfaces the way some people read text. The hoof prints, she'd walked over them last night, or beside them, but the light had been wrong. And her attention had been elsewhere, occupied by the more urgent mathematics of getting an unconscious man onto a horse and keeping him on it for half a mile. Now, in the clear horizontal light of a September morning in Montana, the prints read like a sentence. Pilgrim's prints. Recognizable by the slight unevenness of the left rear shoe, which she'd noticed on the soft ground near the cabin door, the stride pattern of a horse carrying a rider, coming from the north, going south, toward Harwick. She stood on the trail and looked at the prints, and let the direction of them settle into its proper position among everything else she'd been assembling. He had been heading to the station. The rockfall had caught him on the way there, not the way back. He had been on the road at the right time, coming in the right direction, to meet a train that arrived on September 14th. She did not say this out loud to anyone. She filed it in the same place she'd filed the initials above the cabin door, and the way his eyes had gone to them when she'd said Iron Bell Ranch, and she walked back to the cabin with her valise in her hand, and her mother's journal tucked inside it, and the full shape of the situation sitting in her mind, like a puzzle she hadn't been asked to solve, but was going to solve anyway, because she couldn't help it. He was sitting up when she returned, not lying down, not resting, sitting against the log wall with his good knee bent and his injured leg extended, and he was looking at the door beam, the way you look at something when you're having an argument with it, and the argument is not going well. When she came in, his eyes moved to her, then to the valise, then back to her face. The journal was dry, she said. Something moved in his expression. Specific and brief. You look relieved. I am. She set the valise on the table, took the journal out, held it for a moment in the way she always held it, then set it down. It was my mother's. The valise I can replace. She hung her coat on the hook behind the door, the borrowed boots, standing by the entrance now that she'd returned them to the floor. She went to the fire and checked the water level. Then she sat down at the table, took paper and the small pencil from the valise's inside pocket and began to write. What are you writing? A letter to the man at Iron Bell Ranch. She kept her eyes on the paper. Since he wasn't able to meet me at the station, I'm letting him know I've found temporary shelter and will make my way to Harwick by the end of the week to secure lodging and employment while I wait for his response. I'm also asking whether he still intends to honor the arrangement described in his letters, or whether circumstances have changed. She paused, writing steadily, and I'm asking whether he has a foreman named George Kell, who might be sent to collect his horse, which is currently tied behind this cabin eating September grass. The silence from the cot had weight and corners. You're very practical, he said at last. I've had extensive practice, she kept writing. Then, without looking up, If you'd like to add anything, I can include it. Add anything. A message. For anyone at the ranch. She looked up and held his eyes with the directness she'd been maintaining since he opened his. Since you seem to know the valley. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. He did not look away. The fire made its small sounds. The creek made its larger ones. Then she went back to the letter. He said nothing, which she noted was also a kind of answer. She sealed the letter with a drop of candle wax from the stub on the supply shelf and addressed it to E. Calhoun, Iron Bell Ranch, Harding County, Montana Territory, and set it on the table, where he could see it for the rest of the day. There was always a way to get a letter sent if you were willing to do the necessary steps. She had already identified 2 of them, both involving the main North Road and a southbound rider, and she would implement one tomorrow morning before he was awake enough to discuss it. What she did not say, and had not yet decided whether to say, was the full account of what she understood. She had known since the second look at the door beam, the initials above it, the horse with those same initials on its saddlebag, the prints in the trail going south on September 14th, the specific look of a man who had heard his own name used by someone else and needed a beat to build his response, the deliberate withholding of his last name, the way his eyes had gone, twice now, to the carved letters above the door, with the expression of a man reading his own reflection. She was not angry yet. Anger required confirmation, and she didn't have complete confirmation, only very strong suspicion, and she had spent enough time in the vicinity of other people's bad decisions to know that there was a meaningful difference between the two. What she felt instead was the careful, patient attention of a woman who had been handed a puzzle she hadn't requested, and was solving it quietly while she waited for the person holding the remaining pieces to decide what to do with them. She made the cornmeal into something edible. He ate what she gave him without commentary, which she read as either approval or hunger and suspected was both. The light outside went from gold to amber to the cool blue-gray of mountain evening, and she lit the lamp and the cabin contracted to the small warm circle the flame could reach. She pulled her mother's journal toward her and opened it to the first marked page and began reading by lamplight. He watched the ceiling and thought about whatever it was that kept his jaw set and his left hand returning at intervals to the silver ring on his right. She turned pages. He watched the ceiling. The fire held. The second morning had established something between them that the first morning's urgency had not had room for. Not comfort exactly. Something more functional than comfort and less formal than courtesy. The shared understanding of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and are now navigating the aftermath in a space too small for pretense. She checked his stitches after breakfast on the 3rd morning, pressing the skin around the margin of the wound with 2 fingers and watching for heat or spreading redness, finding neither. The edges were holding. The inflammation hadn't climbed. She redressed it with a fresh strip of cloth, boiled in the water she'd heated for cornmeal. The ankle, he said. I'll get to it. It's better than yesterday. She looked at him over the fresh dressing. The stool has been moved. A pause. I needed to test the range of motion. And then the range of motion informed you that standing was inadvisable, I assume. It informed me, he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words, that standing required more preparation. She turned back to the ankle, unwrapped the previous poultice, examined the joint. The bruising was spreading and deepening in the normal progression of damaged tissue doing what damaged tissue did, moving from the site of injury outward, purpling toward the edges. No new instability when she pressed along the bone. The ligaments were doing their protective work by making any further use of the joint painful enough to discourage experimentation. You'll be off this for at least 3 more days, she said. Possibly 5. I know you understand what that means for the schedule. It means we're here. It means we're here, she agreed. Is there anyone at Iron Bell who would send someone looking for you? The pause was 2 beats too long. 1 beat too long would have been uncertainty. 2 beats was calculation. My foreman, he said, George Kell. If I haven't come back by tomorrow morning, he'll send riders up the North Road. Not through the pass. The pass isn't a route he'd think to check. She nodded. So we may be here several days regardless. She did not say, because it was already understood and saying it would have been padding. She stood, went to the supply shelf. The provisions will stretch to 5 days if we're careful. I'll work on careful. She started setting out what they'd need for a midday meal. And then she looked at him directly and asked the question she'd been turning over since she sat down at the table the night before. One question. He looked at her, wary. Present. Is there anything else I need to know about this cabin, this valley, or this situation that would be useful to me before we're snowed in together for 5 days? He held her gaze for a moment that stretched. No, he said. And they both understood that this was not entirely true, and neither of them said so, and the afternoon settled around them like something that had decided to stay. She went back for her valise on the second morning, which meant she had heard enough hoofbeats by the afternoon of the third morning to know the difference between the sound of Pilgrim moving around his tether behind the cabin and the sound of an animal coming down the main south trail with a rider on its back. The distinction was in the pace. Pilgrim moved with the slow, idle rhythm of an animal with nowhere to be. This sound was deliberate, unhurried in the way that had intention behind it rather than ease. She straightened from the pot she'd been washing at the creek bank, held still for 2 seconds, then went inside. There's a rider coming from the south. 1 horse, moving at the pace of official business. The change in him was not dramatic. It was the adjustment of a room when the heaviest furniture moves, and everything else redistributing slightly to account for the new configuration. He straightened against the wall. His right hand went to his hip, found nothing there, and went still. What kind of rider? The kind who was waiting at the Harwick station 2 days ago and wanted $15 I don't owe him. A beat. Something working in his jaw. Stay close to the door. I was planning to stand in the doorway. She set the copper pot on the table. He can't do anything he hasn't already tried. And you can't walk to the door on that ankle without making it significantly worse. So, she looked at him steadily. I'll handle it. The sound he made was not quite a word, but she understood it to mean he had run the available arguments and arrived at the conclusion that she had the better of the position and was not particularly pleased about it. Deputy Silas Pruitt knocked the way people knock when they've already decided you're home. 3 sharp raps with a knuckle, the kind that communicated arrival rather than inquiry. Clara opened the door. He was exactly as she remembered from the station platform, badge catching the afternoon light, hat at its considered angle, the pleasant, blade-dressed in cloth quality of his voice as he said, looking past her into the cabin's interior, Miss Voss. Word reached me there was a woman sheltering at this outpost. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything is fine. His eyes had already moved to the cot, to the man on it. Rhett looked back from across the room with the unhurried attention of a landscape regarding incoming weather, and Pruitt's eyes moved away from him twice and returned twice, which told Clara that, whatever Rhett was doing with his stillness, it was working. There's still the matter we discussed at the station, Pruitt said, his voice doing its careful, pleasant work. The residency documentation. There's no such documentation. She said it the way she said important things, plainly, without the softening that extended an invitation to negotiate. There's no such law in the Montana Territory. I know this because I walked to the main North Road this morning and flagged down a southbound mail rider and sent a letter to the county sheriff's office asking for clarification on the specific statute you cited. Something moved through Pruitt's face, fast, controlled, almost gone. That letter may experience delays. It asked whether a specific law exists. Either it does or it doesn't. If it does, the response will confirm it and I'll come to your office immediately. If it doesn't, she left the sentence open. He looked past her at Rhett again. Rhett had not shifted a single inch. He was occupying his portion of the world with the same settled rootedness he'd brought to everything since he'd opened his eyes in the canyon. Taking up the space he took up without announcement or apology, Pruitt's eyes went to the beam above the door, to the carved letters there. His examination of them had the specific quality of a man remembering something useful. Funny situation for a woman to be in, he said, and the pleasantness had thinned enough that what was underneath it was becoming visible. All the way out here, with a man she doesn't know, in an Iron Bell outpost. He let that sit for a moment. You know who owns this property? I know it belongs to Iron Bell Ranch, which is where I'm headed, as I told you at the station, and you haven't had contact with anyone from that ranch. She felt Rhett's attention from the cot sharp and waiting, observing the direction she chose. I've had contact with the injured man on that cot, who gave his name as Cal, and who is in no condition to ride. Every word true. Selected with care. I haven't been able to reach Iron Bell Ranch because I don't have a horse and he can't ride without assistance. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. A man who sensed the outline of something he couldn't find purchase on. Well, he touched his hat brim. I'll leave you to it then. The pleasantness was entirely absent now, replaced by something that wasn't quite a threat but wore the same shape. Things in this valley have a way of sorting themselves out, one way or another. He remounted. He left at the same deliberate pace he'd arrived at, the pace of a man who wanted you to know he was not being driven. Clara closed the door, stood with her hand on the latch. Behind her, she heard the controlled, deliberate quality of Rhett's breathing, a man managing something he'd have preferred to handle differently. You sent a letter to the sheriff's office this morning. Not anger in his voice. Something more careful than anger. You were asleep. You walked to the main road alone, an hour each way. The trail is straightforward in daylight. That's not. He stopped. She could hear him running the argument to its conclusion, and finding it didn't support the case he wanted to make. When he spoke again, the frustration had been set aside in favor of something that sounded like a statement of established fact. That man is not safe, I know. She moved to the table, opened the journal. That's why I sent the letter before he could stop me. The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence they'd had before. She could feel him working through something, not the practical logic of what she'd done, which he'd understood immediately, but something beneath it. Some adjustment to his picture of her, some recalibration. She didn't fill the silence. Silence was a thing most people felt compelled to repair, and the compulsion usually made them say more than they'd intended. You're not what I expected, he said finally. She looked up. You didn't know to expect me at all. A pause. No, he said, I didn't. She went back to the journal. He went back to whatever it was he was working through. Outside, the creek ran on. The fourth morning, she felt rather than heard him get up. The shift in the cabin's weight, the uneven rhythm of careful footsteps, one foot, and then a lighter placement of the other. She looked up from the journal she'd been reading. He was standing in the middle of the cabin, upright, without the cot or the wall for support. Assessment, she said. Functional. He took a step toward the table, controlled. The bad ankle accepting partial weight, the rest of him compensating. Not comfortable. Functional is the target for today. She closed the journal. Sit down before you've made your point and your body starts making its own decisions about the timeline. He sat in the chair at the table rather than going back to the cot, which was its own kind of progress, and he looked at the journal she'd closed, at the page she'd had open, at her mother's careful illustration of a yarrow plant, labeled in the small, tight handwriting that Clara had been able to read since she was old enough to read anything. Teach me, he said. She looked at him. The plants. He nodded at the journal. What you used on the ankle. What you used on the head wound. I live on 40,000 acres of mountain land, and the nearest doctor is 3 hours in good weather and longer when snow falls, which is most of the year. He met her eyes directly. No performance of humility in it. Just the straightforward accounting of a man who had identified a gap and was proposing to close it. You kept me alive with that knowledge. It seems worth learning. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the journal so he could see the page. Pay attention, she said. I don't repeat myself. He paid attention. She taught the way her mother had taught her, which was not by catalog or list, because the mind retains narrative where it loses inventory. Every plant had its story attached, where it grew and why, what it was for, and what happened when you used it wrong, and beneath the practical information ran the current of all the times her mother had used it, all the people it had helped, all the specific details that made knowledge adhere rather than slide away. Yarrow grew within 30 feet of reliable water sources, flat white flower heads, leaf edges soft and feathery. The smell when you crushed the leaves, the only test that couldn't be faked. She told him about a winter, when she was young enough that the mill district was still her mother's neighborhood, and not yet hers. When a fever had moved through the boarding houses for 6 weeks, and her mother had made yarrow tea every evening, without exception. Did it work? He asked. We didn't get sick that winter, which could mean the yarrow worked, or could mean we were fortunate. She turned the page. My mother said it didn't matter. The habit was worth keeping either way. He considered that. The way he considered things, which was thoroughly and without rushing. Your mother taught you to think like that, he said. She taught me most things I use. What did she teach you that turned out to be wrong? Clara considered it genuinely, the way she considered things that deserved genuine consideration. She thought I'd stay in Zanesville. She kept her voice neutral. It was simply the most accurate answer to the question. She thought learning to manage in a small world was enough. She didn't account for the possibility that the world she was preparing me for would feel too small once I'd learned how to manage it. He was quiet. "Where does a person go?" he said, not quite asking. "When the world they know gets too small." Apparently Montana. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite what she would have called a smile, but in the same territory. "Why did you stay here?" she asked. "In the copper bow." The shift at his mouth receded. He looked at the fire. "My father's land, his father's before that. There's a particular kind of belonging that comes from working the same ground across 3 generations. You stop being someone who owns a place and start being part of it." A pause. "Or you stop noticing the difference until someone asks." It was the most he'd said about himself since he'd opened his eyes in the canyon. She recognized the weight of it and did not add to it by commenting on the weight. She turned the page again. They went to the creek that afternoon. His ankle would hold for 30 minutes of slow walking on level ground. She'd assessed, and he had looked at her with the direct patience of a man who had evaluated the question independently and reached the same conclusion, and they had gone out together, with him moving carefully on the stick he'd shaped and stripped on the 3rd morning, and her walking at his pace without making it visible that she was adjusting. She showed him yarrow where it grew in thick clusters near the bank, let him identify it before she confirmed it, had him crush a leaf between his fingers and hold it to his nose. "That's the test that can't be faked," she said. "If the visual matches and the smell matches, you have it. What's the look-alike? Several plants with white flowers will confuse you at a glance. None of them produce that smell when the leaf is broken." She stood. "The smell is the confirmation you can't manufacture." They moved along the bank, and she showed him dock and mugwort, and the dock look-alike that grew in the drier ground further from the water, the one that caused stomach cramping and had cost her mother a week of misery one spring, before she'd learned to tell them apart by the texture of the underside of the leaf. "How do you hold all of it?" he asked, not skeptically, with genuine curiosity about the mechanism. "The same way you hold anything you learn young. You stop knowing that you know it and start just knowing it." He was standing slightly behind and to her left, weight balanced with the stick, compensating for what the ankle wouldn't provide, and she could feel him considering something that was not about the plants. "You talk about her a great deal," he said. "I repeat what she said, because most of it was right. That's not the same as talking about her." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen versions of before, but not this particular version. Something had shifted in it since the morning on the fallen log, since the conversation about Ruth. It was less defended. Not open, not exactly, but the defense had changed position, like a door that was still closed but had moved on its hinges slightly. "Your turn," she said. He blinked. "You said your father taught you to read the land. Show me something I don't know about this particular piece of it." She gestured at the creek, the tree line, the sky they could see in the gap between the canyon walls. "We've been going in one direction for 4 days. What can you tell me about this place that a book couldn't?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to look at the far bank. "The water level is down about 3 inches from where it was when we got here," he said. "The source is probably a spring somewhere above us to the northeast. When it slows that fast, the snowpack above it has stopped releasing as much melt as it was. Temperature at elevation has dropped." He looked at the sky. "The light today is flatter than yesterday. The shadows under the pines read differently. That's what the sky does when a front is building at a distance." She looked at the sky. Ordinary to her, nothing she would have flagged. "How long?" she asked. "A day and a half, maybe 2. What do we do before it arrives?" "Extra wood inside. Check the north walls chinking. It dries out over the summer and usually has gaps by fall. And once the front moves through, we stay close to shelter. Mountain storms in September can drop 10 degrees in an hour." She filed all of this. "Show me how to check the chinking," she said. He showed her. They worked along the north wall, her hands doing most of it, his direction guiding where to press and what to feel for. She packed the gaps she found with clay from the creek bank, pressing it in with her fingers, smoothing it flat. He showed her how to test the seal with a piece of bark pressed against the fresh clay. They were at the far corner of the north wall when she reached for the highest gap, stretching further than was comfortable, and his hand came to her shoulder briefly, without announcement, steadying her. without converting the gesture into anything more than what it was. She sealed the gap, stepped back, his hand was already gone. Both of them looked at the wall. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They went inside. The storm arrived at the time he'd said it would, which was one of the things she was adding to her accounting of him, the accuracy of his predictions about observable things. 1 hour of warning first. The birds went quiet. The temperature dropped enough to register without a thermometer. The light flattened to something that made the pines look like shapes cut from paper. Clara had the extra wood stacked before he needed to direct it. The water pot filled. The supplies moved away from the north wall. She'd worked through the preparation list from his earlier instructions without being asked, reading the tasks off what he'd said and doing them in order. He was at the table checking her chinking work by feel as she moved things, and twice she saw him press the bark test against a section she'd done and say nothing, which she interpreted as the cabin equivalent of passing marks. Then the sky closed, not gradually. The first drops came in horizontally, driven by a wind that had apparently been organizing itself for days, and then the full weight of the storm landed against the cabin walls, and the cabin went from shelter to fortress in the space of one breath. The north wall held. One spot on the roof above the cot began to drip, a thin line of water catching the lamplight. She moved the supplies she'd already relocated once more, shifted the bedding, positioned the copper pot from its hook to catch the drip. He moved too, pulling things toward the drier sections, working around the problem without requiring it to be explained. He moved through the small space with a precision she hadn't fully registered until now. A tall man in a small room, who had somehow developed over years the precise knowledge of where his own edges were. By midnight the storm was at its full expression, wind working at the door in its frame, rain communicating urgency through the roof. The temperature had dropped the promised 10 degrees in less than an hour, and the edges of the cabin were cold in a way that the fire at its center could warm but couldn't reach. The driest section was the corner beside the hearth. Clara spread both blankets there. He brought the one from the cot. They settled in the way people settle when the available options have consolidated to one, side by side against the warm logs of the chimney wall, the fire's heat reaching them at an angle, close, not touching, the specific distance of two people who understood where a line was and were acknowledging it without making a speech about it. The lamp was out to save the oil. The only light was the fire. "The man at the station," Clara said. She wasn't looking at him, she was watching the fire. "He's been running that residency scheme for a while. Probably. A deputy who runs something like that doesn't build it overnight. He'd need to know which trains were coming in, and which women would be on them, and why. He'd need someone at the station to keep him informed." A pause. "The station master." "Yes. And women who just arrived and don't know the territory and are alone are the easiest targets. Because they're afraid, and because if they pay they're ashamed, and if they're ashamed they don't report it." "Yes." She looked at the fire. "I wasn't afraid. I was annoyed." Something moved in his voice, something she could hear more clearly without the light to read his face by. "I noticed that about you. You don't read as frightened even when a situation warrants it." "I've been frightened," she said. She shifted the blanket slightly. "I made a decision, a long time ago, that frightened wasn't useful information to give to people who were trying to use it against you." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was holding something she'd said and considering it from different angles. "That sounds like a decision made after something specific," he said. "The landlord where we lived after my mother died." She said it the way she said things that had happened long enough ago to have become simply fact rather than wound. "He raised the rent the week after the funeral because he'd seen me cry at the service and decided grief was useful information." Rhett said nothing. She could feel him holding what she'd said with the care she'd noticed he applied to most things. Not responding to information he wasn't yet sure what to do with, sitting with it until he knew. She respected that habit. It was one she shared. They listened to the storm. "Ruth," he said, "you don't have to, I know." A brief pause. "I want to." She waited. She was afraid of one thing, he said. Just one. She was practical, steady, not much rattled her. But she was afraid of being forgotten. Not of dying, of being forgotten afterward, of the specific texture of who she was going away with no record of it. Clara said nothing. Let him continue. "I kept her things for 2 years, her shoes under the bed, her coffee cup on its specific hook." He turned the ring on his finger once, slowly. "George finally told me I was keeping them for myself, not for her. That she was already somewhere the shoes didn't matter. Was he right? He's right about most things. A pause. I gave the shoes to the church donation. Put the cup with the others in the kitchen. It didn't make her more forgotten. It just meant I had to sit with what I'd been using the shoes to avoid sitting with, which was that I didn't know what came next. He said it with the directness of someone who had done the long work of arriving at a truth and was no longer afraid to say it plainly. 44 years of knowing what the next day was going to look like, he said. And then I didn't. Clara turned to look at him. In the firelight, his face was less guarded than she'd seen it. Not unguarded. But the guard had shifted position, the way a door shifts when the latch isn't fully engaged. Is that why you placed the advertisement? She said. Eventually, he looked at the fire. Not at first. At first I placed it because George suggested it and I didn't have a case strong enough to argue against it. George has a quality of seeing things I've missed. And I've learned over the years that when he makes a suggestion I can't argue against, I should probably take it seriously. He paused. I received 43 letters before yours. After the first 20 I understood what I was actually looking for, which I hadn't been able to name before. And what was that? He looked at the fire. She felt him choosing his words with the same precision he'd brought to everything. Someone I'd be glad to know, he said. Not someone to fill a function. Someone I'd actually be glad to know. The wind hit the door hard enough to move it in its frame. Both of them looked. The fire surged in the draft. The moment had been interrupted before the next thing landed. She felt the interruption as a physical event, a space that had opened and then closed before what was meant to occupy it could arrive. She turned back to the fire. You should sleep. The ankle will be significantly worse tomorrow if you don't. He looked at her for a moment in the shifting light, an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he settled back against the chimney wall. Clara, quietly into the noise of the storm. Yes, I'm going to tell you something tomorrow. He said it with the care of a man making a commitment he intended to honor. Something I should have told you the first morning. She looked at him. His face was serious. The expression of a man who had finished an internal argument and reached the side he knew was right. All right, she said. She kept her voice even, gave nothing away because she already knew, in its broad outline, what he was going to tell her. She had known since the second morning, when she'd stood in front of the carved letters above the door and done the arithmetic, and she had been waiting for him to get there in his own time, which was, she had decided, the only time that would mean anything. She fell asleep sometime after the storm peaked, which she would not have predicted. But exhaustion had its own accounting system, and it had decided to collect what she owed. She woke in the deep middle of the night to a cabin that had pulled back from the worst of it, the storm still present but no longer pressing directly against the walls. The fire had burned low. She was warm. The blankets had been arranged at some point she didn't remember, covering her more completely than they'd been when she'd settled. She lay still. Rhett was not asleep. She could tell by the quality of his breathing, deliberate and present, in the way that sleep never was. And beneath it, barely at the threshold of hearing, words, not directed at her, not directed at anyone in the room, but at something he was working through in the way that men, who carried things alone, apparently worked through them. She caught shapes of it, should have told her. The very first morning, she doesn't know, and when she does, he didn't finish. Or he did finish, but somewhere below what she could reach. Clara lay still, eyes nearly closed. She thought about the hoofprints going south toward Harwick on September 14th. She thought about 47 words, and what kind of man wrote them and meant everyone. She thought about a man who had laughed at a memory he'd been afraid to touch, and found it still warm when he got there. She thought, he's carrying it like something he's trying to figure out how to return. Eventually his breathing changed. Deepened. The rhythm of a man who had finally stopped and let sleep take what it was owed. Clara opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. At the shadows the fire's coals threw across the log beams, and let the full weight of the situation be what it was without managing it. She gave herself until the coals went dark. Then she would sleep. And in the morning he would tell her what he'd decided to tell her, and she would decide how to respond to what she'd already known for 4 days. That was the only honest way through. Dawn replaced darkness the way Montana always replaced it after a storm, not gradually, not with any particular gentleness, but by subtraction. The black went first, then the deepest gray, and what remained was a thin pale blue that had nothing apologetic about it. The creek was running higher than it had been the previous evening, fed by everything the slopes above had collected overnight, and louder for it, and the pines outside the cabin were still dripping at their tips. Rhett was standing at the open door when Clara woke. He'd pulled it wide to the cold and the smell of wet stone and the silence of a landscape that had been worked over, and was now waiting to see what filled the space the storm had left behind. He heard her move and didn't turn around. "We need to leave today," he said. She sat up. 6 nights on a plank floor had assembled a comprehensive inventory of opinions across her back and shoulders, and they all submitted their reports simultaneously. The ankle, better than yesterday. He turned. His face held a quality she hadn't seen before in him. Not the careful watchfulness he'd maintained since he'd opened his eyes in the canyon, not the guarded attention of a man deciding how much to say. Something had finished resolving in him overnight. The expression of a person who has been standing at a door for a long time and has finally chosen to open it. "There's somewhere I need to take you." She looked at him. Where? The pause that followed was the last one of its kind, though she didn't know that yet. "Trust me," he said. "Can you do that?" Clara thought about what she'd heard in the dark hours, his voice working through something below the threshold of directed speech, words that were not for her, but that she'd caught the shape of anyway. She thought about a man who had laughed at a memory he'd believed was beyond his reach and discovered it wasn't. She thought about 47 words, and what kind of person wrote them, and then got on a horse 2 days early because he didn't want weather to make him late. "Yes," she said. "I reckon I can." Something moved through his face. Not relief, not yet. The breath before relief. The loosening that happens when a person stops carrying something alone and hasn't yet felt the full weight of what it means to put it down. Good. He looked out the open door at the cold, bright morning. "Get your things. We leave when you're ready." She was ready in 10 minutes. She was always ready quickly. She had never understood the point of delay when the direction was already decided. They rode out as the last of the storm's cold was lifting, Pilgrim carrying both of them north through a world the rain had pressed flat and then released. The grass was standing again. The creek ran alongside them, loud with everything it had collected. The peaks to the north wore the season's first proper snow against a sky that had decided, after what appeared to have been significant argument with itself, to be entirely clear. Clara sat in front. Rhett behind her, his arm around her waist, because the trail was uneven, and she had no stirrups, and the switchbacks climbing out of the canyon required someone to ensure she didn't go sideways on the turns. That was the accurate and complete accounting of it. She applied that accounting carefully and found it precise, and also found that precision did not cover everything. It's because the warmth that came through her coat reached her in ways that had nothing to do with practical necessity, and she decided not to examine that particular gap until she had solid ground underfoot and a moment that wasn't moving. She watched the aspens on the far bank of the creek they were following, yellow now. Every individual leaf had committed. They trembled in the thin morning wind with the specific motion of things that understand their season is finite and intend to use all of it. He began talking after 20 minutes. Not the way he'd talked in the cabin, in pieces extracted carefully, each word weighed before release. He talked the way a river moves when you remove what has been containing it. Her name was Vera Sloan. Not the name of a woman he'd loved, the name of a storm he'd survived and had been living in the shadow of since. She answered the advertisement he'd placed in the fall of 1885. 3 letters over 2 months, careful and specific, with nothing in them that sounded like a performance of what she thought he wanted to hear. She arrived on the November stage and she was exactly what she'd described, clear-eyed, practical, not trying to be more than she'd represented herself as. 6 weeks after the ceremony, she was gone. $3,000 from the locked box in his office, his best mare, a saddlebag he'd had since he was 20, worn smooth along the strap from years of use. Turned out she'd done it before, different name each time, different territory each time, and the federal marshal's office had a file on her that they sent him 3 weeks after she left. 3 weeks, which was when letters arrived, when you would have traded most of what you owned to have had them 2 months earlier. He stopped talking. The trail opened onto the valley floor, and the grassland spread before them, in long, slow waves of gold and pale green, running north until the mountains caught it, and then the mountains ran further. Fence lines appeared on the horizon, thin, dark threads pulled straight across the land. the shape of buildings resolving slowly from the distance, too far still to read as specific structures, but close enough to understand as organized intention. Clara breathed in through her nose and let it out. She had seen fields before. Ohio had fields, but Ohio fields were arguments for a principle. The principle that land should be contained and comprehensible and scaled to what a person could take in from one vantage point. What was spread before her operated on a different logic entirely. It didn't try to be comprehensible. It simply was all the way to where the mountains began, and then the mountains continued the project. He gave her the silence to absorb it. After that, he said he was finished. No more advertisements, no more strangers. The ranch was enough, the work was enough. George Kell hadn't argued, because George had the particular quality of knowing when argument wasn't what a situation needed, and recognizing when a man had made a decision that needed to be lived rather than debated. But then he placed another one. He said this with the plain honesty of a man who had lost an argument with himself and saw no point in disguising it. 8 months after the notice ran, the letters began arriving. 43 before hers. Most of them he could read through the first paragraph and understand what he was reading. Not because the women were dishonest. Most of them wanted something genuine. But he could see the calculation beneath the words, the specific shape of hope, organized toward a particular outcome. And the legibility of that shape told him too much about what he was being chosen for rather than who he was. Hers was the 44th. He read it on a Tuesday evening in November, at the kitchen table, after the hands had gone in for the night and the house was quiet, in the way that large empty houses are quiet, which is a particular kind of quiet that has nothing peaceful about it. He read it twice, set it down, and picked it up again. Why, Clara said. Because it was the first letter in 43 that didn't tell me what the writer thought I wanted to hear. He said it to the back of her head, to the valley opening before them. You wrote about your mother's handwriting in an herb journal. You wrote that you were competent at necessary things and uninteresting at most everything else, which is a sentence no one writes if they're trying to make an impression. You wrote that you expected a fair chance and nothing beyond it. A pause. You wrote like someone who had decided that whatever she was, I could either want that or not, and that the wanting or not was the only worthwhile basis for the whole enterprise. Clara said nothing. She remembered writing that letter. She remembered thinking she was probably writing herself out of any response by being too direct about too little and not particularly minding. I wrote back the same night, he said. I meant every word of it. I know. She looked at the mountains, at the snow on the peaks catching the morning light while everything below them was still in shadow. I could tell. The buildings ahead had resolved from suggestion into specificity. The main house, 2 stories, set back from the work structures, a wraparound porch, east-facing windows on the upper floor, a kitchen garden to the south, and the gate, iron. Substantial posts sunk deep into the ground, a crossbar overhead, and worked into the crossbar's center a 5-pointed bell shape forged in iron, solid and dimensional, not ornamental in the way of something put up to make an impression. Declarative, this is what this place is, this has a name. So you came to meet me, she said. I left Iron Bell on the 12th. I wanted 2 days on the road instead of 1. The copper bow weather in September can close a pass overnight, and I didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of a front and arrive late. He shifted slightly behind her. Pilgrim stepped wrong on a loose section of shale in the upper pass on the 13th. She went down fast. The slide came before I could get clear. The open land stretched before them. The fence lines firming up. The smudge of buildings becoming walls and roof lines, and the meticulous arrangement of structures built by someone who thought about permanence. When I woke up and you were there, he said, and you didn't know my name, and you were looking at me the way you look at a problem that requires solving, rather than a person whose name you needed to know. He paused. I made a decision I cannot defend. You decided to stay unknown. Yes, because you wanted to see who I was without the weight of who you are. Yes. He said it with the directness of a man owning something without softening it, without reaching for an apology that would cost him nothing and change nothing. It was wrong. I knew that while I was doing it, I did it anyway, because being wrong about a person once had gotten into me in a way I hadn't finished working through, and the chance to watch you work without the ranch or the money or the name anywhere in the room. Another pause. I told myself it was information I needed. It was fear with better clothes on. Clara looked at the valley laid out before them. Were the letters real? She said. All 47 words. He straightened behind her, the full height of a man drawing himself to what he actually was. Everyone, he said. Then that, she said, is the only reason I'm still on this horse with you. He had no answer for that. She hadn't required one. George Kell came out of the barn before they'd made it through the gate, moving at the version of running that 3 decades of physical work permits, fast and rolling and efficient in a way that didn't look like it should be. He was calling before the words resolved, and then they did. Rhett, Lord Almighty. He stopped 4 feet away and looked up at the man on the horse, with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing bad news for 6 days, and finds himself entirely unprepared for the alternative. His eyes were wet. He didn't do anything to manage that. We found your hat in the pass, and the blood on the rocks, and Pilgrim gone, and we thought. He stopped. I'm not dead. Rhett's voice carried something it hadn't carried in the cabin, a gravity that came not from effort but from long practice of being the person other people organized around. He said it plainly. Clara Voss found me in the pass. She kept me alive. If you had been in the same position with the same injuries, you wouldn't have made it through the first night. George looked at Clara. A thorough assessment, fast and unhurried at the same time, the kind built over decades of evaluating people under working conditions, reading the difference between someone who had understood hard circumstances and someone who had simply endured one. Whatever he found met whatever standard he was applying. He took his hat off and held it to his chest. Ma'am, I believe I know who you are. Then you know considerably more than I did when I arrived, Clara said. George blinked, looked at Rhett, looked back at Clara, put his hat on. A man filing information and moving forward. Agnes Cole appeared on the porch steps. She came down them with the same practical economy she applied to everything. Looked at the stitches on Rhett's forehead, at the ankle wrap, at Clara, and said, "Come inside," to both of them while looking at Clara when she said it. George pulled Rhett aside while Clara helped with the front door, which had swollen in the rain and required persuasion. She didn't hear everything. She didn't try to. But she heard enough through the gap that a heavy, wet door and good intentions together provided. Pruitt had come to the ranch the previous morning, had spoken with Bacole at the door, asking about property boundaries and whether there was any outstanding legal uncertainty about Iron Bell's title, while Rhett was unaccounted for. Had cited something about intestate complications on properties with pending marriage correspondence. Bacole had told him to leave. He'd gone. But he'd left knowing 2 things. That Rhett had been expected at Harwick on the 14th to meet a woman who'd answered his advertisement, and that a week of unexplained absence had produced exactly the kind of legal ambiguity that a man with access to forged documents might find worth moving on. Clara absorbed this while she worked the door latch free. Not impulsive then. He'd been building towards something before she'd even stepped off the train. The approach at the station had been an opening move, not the whole plan. The whole plan was larger. And the whole plan required Rhett to stay missing long enough for the ambiguity to solidify into something actionable. She thought about the letter she'd sent 2 mornings ago to the county sheriff's office, a single yes or no question about a law that did not exist. She thought, that letter is going to matter sooner than I expected. The house was warm and well maintained, with the high ceilings and worn floors of a building accustomed to being inhabited. Bacole led Clara upstairs without commentary. Opened a door on the upper landing, stepped back. Clara went in, east-facing. She registered this first because of the window, 2 panes wide, positioned to catch the morning light before it reached any other part of the house. The sky outside was the hard, thin blue of post-storm morning, the mountains close and sharp in the rinsed air. A bed with a white hand-stitched quilt, interlocking rings worked in cream and pale blue thread, a wardrobe of dark oak, calico in 2 colors, practical cuts, and at the back, the corner of blue silk, a dress cut simply, without excess, a washstand, a porcelain basin, a cake of soap beside it. She leaned close. Lavender, not rose. Not the default assumption most people made about what women wanted. Lavender, because she had written in her second letter about her mother, keeping dried lavender between the pages of the herb journal, and what the book smelled like when it was opened. He had read that. He had remembered it. A rocking chair positioned at the window's angle, not against the wall. At the window, because she had written that rooms without outward views felt like they were trying to convince you the world outside didn't exist. and that she had never been willing to be convinced of that. He had read that too. Clara stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Below her, the ranch returning to its ordinary rhythms. Voices she couldn't make out. A horse in the corral. The sound of George giving direction in the efficient shorthand of a man who didn't need to explain himself twice. She crossed to the window and put her forehead against the cool glass. The valley stretched north to where the mountains began in earnest. Fence lines. Cattle moving in the middle distance with the unhurried deliberation of animals that had no strong opinions about time. The creek she'd followed for 6 days was visible as a line of darker green through the grass, still running, still entirely certain of its direction. She was angry. She needed to name that directly, the way you name a thing, so it doesn't become something you're navigating around without acknowledging. Not the hot, sharp anger that burns fast and is mostly fear in other clothing, the slower kind. The kind that came from having been treated as something to be observed rather than someone to be known, and from having in everything she had to give in that cabin, without being given the basic honesty of who she was giving it to. She was also something else. This required the same clear accounting. She had known for 5 of the 6 days. She had watched him carry the weight of what he wasn't saying, and had measured what he did with everything she offered. He hadn't used it. He hadn't converted it to advantage. He'd held it with the care of someone who knew it had been given rather than owed, and who was trying to work out how to deserve it. Both things were true at the same time. That was the actual situation, and she was going to be accurate about the actual situation, or she was going to be no use to herself or anyone else. She sat in the rocking chair. It was positioned exactly as she would have positioned it herself. The knock came an hour later. She had washed her face at the basin, the water cold and exact. She had combed 6 days of trail out of her hair. She had taken the simpler of the 2 calico dresses from the wardrobe, and it fit well enough to confirm that someone had been paying close attention to more than just the words in her letters. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. Her face was thinner than it had been in Zanesville. Her eyes were the same. Her mother's eyes, dark and direct, belonging to a woman who looked at things long enough to see them as they were. "Come in," she said. Rhett stood in the doorway, washed, changed into a clean shirt. The shadow at his jaw was still there and would need another day. He held his hat at his side, not working it in his hands. "May I come in? It's your house. It's your room," he said. "Quiet and entirely certain of it, if you want it to be." She looked at him. He looked at her. The room between them with its interlocking ring quilt and its east window and its lavender soap. "You have something to tell me," she said. "You said so last night." He came in and sat at the end of the bed, practical rather than presumptuous. The room had 1 chair, she was in it, and the floor was the alternative. He held his hat at his side and looked at a specific knot in the pine board for a moment, the focused non-focus of a man organizing what he needs to say and how precisely to say it. 3 years after Ruth died, he began. Not at the beginning she'd anticipated, but somewhere deeper. I couldn't find the center of the day. The ranch ran because George ran it and I moved alongside him. But I wasn't there in any way that counted. He set his hat on the bed beside him. George told me I needed to decide something. Not about the ranch. About what I was going to do with the part of my life that wasn't the ranch. He said a man who stopped building anything outside his work would eventually stop finding reasons to do the work. He'd watched it happen. Men who outlived the people they'd been working toward. A pause. He told me to place an advertisement. I told him it was too soon. He said he wasn't suggesting I replace Ruth. He was suggesting I give myself a reason to come in for supper. Clara looked at the mountains through the window. The shadow line had climbed. The peaks were all in sun now. "So you placed one," she said, "and then Vera Sloan, and then Vera Sloan. And then I didn't place another for 18 months. When I did it the way you do something you've decided to do, but aren't willing to be hopeful about." He looked at his hat. "Your letter was the 44th I received. I read it on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table after the hands had gone in. Read it twice, put it down, picked it up, and read it again. Why? Because it was the first letter in 43. That didn't tell me what the writer thought I wanted to hear." He looked at her. "You wrote like someone who had decided that whatever she was, I could either want that or not, and that the wanting or not was the only worthwhile basis for the whole enterprise." Clara said nothing. She remembered writing that letter. She remembered deciding not to cross out the sentence about being uninteresting and leaving it because the alternative was pretending, and she had decided years ago that pretending was not a sustainable position. I wrote back the same night, he said. I meant every word of it, I know. She looked at him steadily. I could tell. He held her gaze with something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the open expression she'd caught glimpses of across the 6 days, but something past it. Something that had gotten to the other side of a door it had been standing in front of for a considerable time. How long have you known who I was? The second morning, she said, plainly, without drama. The letters above the cabin door, the horse, the way your face shifted when I said Iron Bell Ranch and you needed a beat to build your response. She looked at the window. I decided to wait. I wanted to see what you did with what I gave you. He was very still. You were careful with it, she said. You didn't put it to use. You didn't convert it to something that served you. You carried it the way a person carries something borrowed that they're not sure how to return. A pause. That told me something. He let out a breath that had been held at real cost. The loosening of something he'd been bracing against for 6 days. I should have told you the first morning, he said. Yes, I was afraid. I know. And you know it, which is why you haven't tried to make that into an explanation. She looked at him without flinching and without hardening. I'm angry, Rhett. I want you to know that clearly, because you deserve to know what's actually true rather than a managed version of it. You studied me without my knowledge or consent. The fact that the study came from fear rather than calculation doesn't change what it was. He held her eyes, did not look for the version of what she'd said that had a softer reading, simply received it. Yes, he said, but I also want you to know something. She looked at the mountains through the glass. I came here prepared to deal honestly with whatever I found. The version of this where you told me who you were in the pass, and we had 6 days in that cabin as exactly who we are. I think that version would have been fine. I know. His voice had roughened slightly. I think about that version, so do I. She looked back at him. What I need you to understand is that I'm not going to perform being less angry than I am to make this easier for either of us, and I'm not going to perform being angrier than I am to make a point. Her eyes on his, level and direct. I'm telling you the truth because that's what I have and what I deal in. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not one thing. It was several things arriving in sequence, and underneath all of them, something that had been under pressure for a very long time and had finally been released from it. There's one more thing, he said. Something I should have told you that I haven't. She waited. I was coming, he said, to the station. I left Iron Bell 2 days before the 14th so I'd have time if the weather changed. I was on the road to Harwick when pilgrims stepped wrong in the pass. He paused. I didn't fail to arrive, I was stopped. Clara looked at him, thought about the hoof prints she'd seen in the soft earth of the upper pass. When she'd walked back for her valise, on the second morning, the stride pattern of a horse carrying a rider moving from north to south on the 14th of September. She had filed that information and carried it and not used it until he was ready to get there himself. I know, she said. I found the tracks when I went back for my bag. He stared at her. She let that sit in its proper place alongside everything else. And then she said, it matters. Not because it changes what happened in the cabin, but because it tells me something about the 47 words that I couldn't have verified any other way. His throat moved. He swallowed once. She stood from the rocking chair and crossed to the window, and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the valley, at the fence lines, at the cattle in the middle distance. The room, she said. Yes. You chose lavender soap. You mentioned your mother kept lavender in the herb journal. His voice careful with the memory. I thought. He stopped himself, and the rocking chair at the window rather than against the wall. You wrote in one of your letters that you liked to see where you were. That rooms without windows felt like they were trying to make you forget the world was outside. She turned from the window and looked at him, at this large and careful and frightened man who had read her letters enough times to remember a sentence about windows and had placed a chair accordingly. I need time, she said, to decide what I want to do with all of this. Not forever. I don't think it's a long time, but time. However long to the door. Put her hand on the frame, turned back. Rhett, he looked up. The 47 words. Every one, he said. I am certain of that above everything else in this room. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then we have something to work with, she said. Come find me when you've rested. I want to see the kitchen garden before the light goes. She left him there and went downstairs to begin learning the shape of the place she'd walked 4 days and 12 miles and 47 words to find. The kitchen garden was better organized than it had looked from the upper window. Someone had thought carefully about sun exposure and drainage, and the result was a garden that produced rather than merely persisted. Bacall walked beside her and didn't speak, which Clara appreciated, because she understood that assessment required attention, and attention required quiet. The yarrow section, Clara said, stopping at the far end where a few sparse plants were doing poorly in soil that was too dry and too shaded. It needs to be within 20 feet of a reliable water source. That's where it grows. Move it to where it can reach the roof runoff and it'll establish itself properly. Bacall looked at the yarrow, looked at Clara, said nothing. The following morning, irrigation pipe had been laid along the garden's east edge, and the yarrow section had been relocated. Clara noticed and said nothing. She understood that this was its own kind of conversation. The first week at Iron Bell moved in the rhythm of a place that knew what it was and did not require explanation. She had said she needed time, and Rhett had said however long, and both of them had meant it, which meant the days could be what they needed to be, rather than what anxiety might have demanded. She learned the house by working in it, helped Bacall in the kitchen, not as a guest making gestures toward helpfulness, but as a person taking on a share of what needed to be done. George watched this. He watched most things, she concluded, and had opinions about most of what he watched, which he kept to himself unless asked. "You going to stay?" he asked her on the 4th morning. They were at the east fence where she'd walked at first light, and found him already there, doing what he apparently did at this hour every morning, standing at this particular fence and looking at the mountains. He didn't look at her when he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded. Fair enough. That was the complete exchange. She found she respected him enormously for it. Rhett gave her room. She could see the deliberateness of this, the effort it cost him, the way he placed himself at the edges of her days rather than the center. He came to meals. He found her in the evenings in the places she'd started to occupy, the kitchen garden at dusk, the east porch in the mornings, the small library after supper, where she discovered he had considerably more books than she'd anticipated and several she had strong opinions about. "You've read this one," she said one evening, holding up a worn volume of natural history from the shelf, its binding cracked at the same pages from repeated opening, 3 times. "The section on soil composition is wrong in 2 places, the rest holds." "Which places?" he told her. She had a different opinion about one of them. They disagreed specifically, and with genuine interest for 20 minutes. And then found they agreed about everything else. She went to bed thinking that a man who read natural history until he located the errors was probably someone she could talk to indefinitely, without either of them running short of things to say. She didn't tell him this. It wasn't yet the kind of thing she was saying. On the 7th day she went into Harwick with Bacall for supplies. The town was larger than the station had suggested. A proper main street, a general store, a post office, a building that served alternately as courthouse and meeting hall. People looked at her. The valley was small and information moved at the speed of human curiosity, which was faster than most other things. She met their attention directly. At the general store, a woman named Della introduced herself and said, "You're the one who came through last week, who was at Iron Bell when Pruitt rode in with his paper. I had information that was relevant. Anyone with the same information could have used it." Della had the handshake of someone who worked with her hands and didn't modify it for introductions. She said Pruitt had been running the residency scheme for 3 years. 3 years of women arriving on correspondence trains and him waiting at the station. Then Edna Morse came over from the post office counter, where she'd been standing long enough to have heard everything. She was 41, a widow, and her hands weren't entirely steady, but her voice was. "I paid him $15 in 1,884, she said. "I've been ashamed of that for 3 years. I thought I was the only one who fell for it." She looked at Clara, with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something alone, and has just caught sight of someone who might understand the weight of it, without requiring explanation. "The sheriff asked me last week if I'd give a statement. I told him I needed to think about it." She paused. "I've finished thinking," she said. "My answer is yes." By the time Clara and Bacall had finished their supply run, she had spoken with 6 more women and 2 men. all of whom knew exactly who she was and had things to say about Pruitt. The sheriff's inquiry into 3 years of his conduct was underway. What she hadn't known until now was how many people had been waiting for that inquiry and for how long. She rode back to Iron Bell in the supply wagon, thinking about community as a thing with shape and weight, distinct from geography. She had grown up in a city of hundreds of thousands and had been largely invisible in it. This valley held perhaps 800 souls, and she had been present in it for 7 days and was already not invisible. That was worth something. She was still working out the precise amount. On the 14th day, Rhett found her in the kitchen garden at dusk. She had been there for an hour, working with her hands in the soil while the light changed, letting her thoughts settle where they would without directing them. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. "I have something to tell you," he said. "The last thing, the one I haven't said." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He came to where she was and crouched beside the yarrow she'd relocated to better ground. He looked at the plant rather than at her. "George told me something the morning I left for Harwick," he said, "before I rode out. He said if I was going to do this, go meet you, bring you here, I had to be willing to be known. Not known as the man who owned the land. Known as whoever I actually was underneath the land." He turned a yarrow leaf over lightly with one finger. He said you can't ask someone to trust you if you won't let them see you. That demonstrating trustworthiness from a safe distance wasn't the same thing as actually offering it. "He was right," Clara said. "He usually is." He looked at the plant. "I left that morning intending to be honest with you from the moment we met. I decided that whatever had happened with Vera Sloan, I was going to go to that station and introduce myself as who I was and find out what happened from there." Pause. "And then I woke up in the pass and you were there and you didn't know my name." He stopped. "I've thought about why I made the choice I made, and I can't give you an account of it that satisfies me. I can tell you it came from fear. I can tell you it was wrong. I can tell you that every day in that cabin, watching you work and think and give what you gave, I understood more clearly what it cost you to not know who you were giving those things to." Clara looked at his profile, at the scar above his eyebrow already fading toward what it would be for the rest of his life. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You keep saying that in ways that suggest you know more than I've told you." "I do." She held his eyes. "I knew most of it in the cabin. The rest I've understood since I got here." She stood, brushed the soil from her hands, looked at the mountains going purple as the light failed, the peaks still holding the last gold above where the shadow line had risen. "I came here looking for a roof and 4 walls and somewhere that was mine," she said. That was true. She looked at him. But it wasn't the whole truth. "The whole truth is that I came looking for someone worth knowing. Someone who would look at me the way you have to look at something, if you're actually going to know it all the way, not only the parts that don't require anything." She held his gaze. "I found that. The harder parts are also real. But I found what I came looking for." He looked at her, with his face completely clear of everything he'd been carrying. "Then stay," he said. The simplest possible version of what he'd been trying to say for 2 weeks. "I'll stay," she said. The evening settled around them like something that had decided to remain. A meadowlark called once from out in the pasture, bright and singular, and then was quiet. The kitchen garden gave off the clean, sharp smell of growing things doing exactly what they were made to do. He stood. He put his hand on the arm of her chair, not on her hand, on the wood beside it, the precise restraint of a man who understood that closeness was not the same as claim. She moved her hand, let her fingers rest on the back of his, lightly, the way you set something down on a surface you're still learning. He went completely still. The stillness of someone being careful with something they cannot afford to get wrong. "The 47 words," she said. "Everyone." His voice from somewhere low and certain. "And every day after, if you'll let me." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the east. The mountains held their ground against the darkening sky. Behind them, the house was lit and warm. She was not where she had expected to be when she bought the ticket in Zanesville. She was not who she'd expected to be either. Neither was he. And the distance between expected and actual was not loss. It was the shape of something built from what was real rather than what had been planned. She thought that was probably how it was supposed to work when it worked at all. She drank her yarrow tea. He held her hand. The stars came on one at a time, and then all at once the way they did out here, as if they'd been waiting for someone to sit still long enough to notice them. Spring came to Copperbow Valley the way it always came, not gradually and not gently, but all at once. Winter releasing its hold on a single warm afternoon in April, and the green following within days. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. The aspens came back in the order they'd left. Clara's herb garden was the first thing she had claimed at Iron Bell. Not requested, claimed. The south-facing patch behind the kitchen, where the roof runoff kept the soil workable into the season. She'd laid it out in October and spent the winter with seed catalogs and correspondence and careful planning, and by late April the first rows were showing green in the cold morning light. She was on her knees between the yarrow and the dock on a Tuesday morning when she stopped working, set the trowel down, put both hands flat against the earth and held them there, feeling the warmth the soil had stored, how deep it went now, how far down the heat reached compared to what she'd found when she'd first broken this ground in the fall. Then she moved one hand to the front of her apron and held it there, still, listening. George Kell came around the corner of the house with a fence post he was taking to the lower pasture. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her hands, at where they were, at the expression on her face. 30 years with the Calhoun family. He was very good at reading what he saw. "Morning, Mrs. Calhoun," he said, in the same voice he used for everything, steady and proceeding. "Morning, George," she said. He went on with his post. Neither of them said anything more about it. But he paused at the corner of the Chuangu on his way past out of her sightline and stood there for a moment with his hat off. She didn't see this. She was already back in the garden, her hands in the earth, thinking about what her mother had said once about planted things, that you couldn't rush what needed time to find its form, and that the most important work was the kind you couldn't see happening. She was still in the garden when Rhett came out at dusk with 2 cups. Yarrow tea, dried leaves steeped 5 minutes exactly. Water just off the boil. He had learned it in the first week, and made it without being asked ever since. The way he'd absorbed other things she'd mentioned once, and hadn't mentioned again. He sat on the low fence beside the garden, and handed her a cup. She took it and stood beside him, and they looked at the mountains in the last light, the peaks going from gold to rose to the deep blue that came just before dark. After a while she set her cup on the fence post. She took his free hand and placed it flat against the front of her apron, his hand. Enormous and calloused, the hand that had seized her wrist in the dark of the fever night, with the grip of a man holding on to the only solid thing available. The hand that had lain open on a blanket and received half a dry biscuit from a woman who did not yet know his name, and had given it anyway because the arithmetic was straightforward, and her mother had raised her to do straightforward arithmetic. She placed it there and held it there with both of hers. He felt what she was telling him. She watched the knowledge arrive in his face. The moment it landed. The moment after that, when it settled into something permanent. And then the thing that opened behind it, which she had seen pieces of across the months, glimpses of it in the cabin and on the porch, and in the library over a disputed passage in a natural history book, and now all of it at once. The whole of it, present and unguarded. "Oh," he said, one word, just that, and then, quieter, in the voice of a man hearing something he'd been listening for without knowing he was listening. "Oh," different the second time, entirely different. His hand stayed where she'd placed it, hers stayed over it. The garden gave off its clean, sharp smell. The house behind them was lit and warm. Her mother's journal sat on the library shelf where it had always sat, next to the natural history book with its 2 wrong sections, available for consultation at any hour. The rocking chair stood at the east window, where it had always been, positioned for someone who wanted to see where she was. The 47 words were in the drawer of the small table beside the bed, the fold lines worn soft from handling. Read so many times the paper had learned the shape of being read. Still true, everyone still true. And now at last, the beginning of a story longer than 47 words could hold.